Who are you? Right. Ray who?
Last year marked the end of an era for Star Wars. The Rise of Skywalker bookended the new sequel trilogy, which, to put it mildly, was a pretty divisive experience. But it's over now, and the future of this beloved yet fiercely debated franchise is wide open. So, where do we go from here? It is clear that by now everyone has their own ideas about what Star Wars should be, that its identity no longer lets itself be captured by a singular vision. This is hardly a surprise given that it has been almost half a century since A New Hope released, and since then there have been countless films, television shows, video games, books, comics, and other works set within this faraway galaxy, all with their own take on what it is that defines Star Wars. Even the films in the sequel trilogy couldn't seem to agree on this, but we'll get into that. Right now, the question I am interested in is what this all means for the future of Star Wars. How are we to relate ourselves to this cultural phenomenon that is no longer just about a fantastical world of lightsabers and plasma pistols, but also increasingly about our own attachments to it, about divided fan bases and conflicting viewpoints? So today, let's talk about Star Wars, examine what it was, what it became over time, and where it might go in the future. But before we do that, Please indulge me for a minute by letting me tell you a Star Wars story you definitely haven't heard before. My own. I grew up around the release of the prequel trilogy, and so my first encounter with Star Wars was seeing The Phantom Menace, followed by Attack of the Clones a few years later. At this point, I thought Star Wars was pretty fun, but nothing more than that. My childhood obsessions were largely fixated on this and this. Then, in 2004, I stumbled upon a video game. Inspired by the Battlefield series, Star Wars Battlefront was a shooter game that let you play as a soldier in many of the iconic Star Wars battles. You could fight on different planets, choose between a range of classes, and man all kinds of vehicles. It was lots of fun. Needless to say, I was hooked. Initially, however, I only had a demo that allowed me to play one level, that being the Battle of Endor as seen in Return of the Jedi. But I had never seen Return of the Jedi. I didn't even know it existed. As a result, I thought the stormtroopers were the clones from Attack of the Clones. They didn't look exactly the same, but they had the shiny armor. They had those cool walking vehicles. I figured they had to be the good guys. It wasn't until months later that I got the full game, which contained bits of footage from the original trilogy, that the penny dropped. Besides making me feel a little bad about picking the wrong side of intergalactic history, and about proudly proclaiming how good I had gotten at hunting down rebel scum. The full game also got me interested in the history of Star Wars. It became clear to me just how much story there still was for me to explore. And so, just before the release of Revenge of the Sith, I got the DVD box of the original trilogy and watched where it all began.
What's this?
Now, I wish I could say this was the moment where I became a true fan, but I'd be lying if I did. I like the films a lot, and I've come to appreciate them more as the years pass. But being a kid who was used to seeing this, and this, and this, the original trilogy didn't have that same immediate impact. It kind of felt like I had missed the boat, that I was born too late to experience these films with the same novelty and wonder as I'm sure they were experienced back then. Still, it was nice to finally have the full context of these stories. It definitely helped me enjoy Revenge of the Sith a lot more, which I found to be a huge step forward compared to Attack of the Clones, though it still suffered significantly under the clunky direction of George Lucas. And it increased my enjoyment of the video games. Star Wars Battlefront 2 had also come out around this time, which, among other new features, let you play as the classic heroes and villains. Again, it was lots of fun. Skipping ahead a couple of years, Star Wars Battlefront now looks like this, and more importantly, we are getting a new trilogy of Star Wars films.
There's been an awakening. Have you felt it?
The Force Awakens is set after the events of Return of the Jedi, and aim to both introduce a new generation to Star Wars, as well as provide a continuation of the original story for longtime fans. Like many others, I was very excited. The trailers looked phenomenal, but above all, I was ready to experience Star Wars in a way I imagined people did when the original films came out. I was ready to be blown away, to have my own definitive Star Wars experience. But after seeing it, my only thoughts were that it was fine, I guess. On the surface, all the right elements were there, too many even. It was almost a remake more than it was a sequel at times. And yet, the feeling was different. And I think one of the reasons for this was because the storytelling had changed. Or more specifically, the context of the storytelling had changed. This became more obvious in The Last Jedi. But first, let's back up a bit and take a closer look at the original trilogy and how it told its story. The original Star Wars films were famously modeled after Joseph Campbell's monomyth, more commonly known as the hero's journey. I've talked about Campbell's work in depth in other videos, so I won't do that here. But what you need to know is that it covers mythological stories. It's about archetypes, about symbolical reflections of our inner being. All the gods, all the heavens, all the world are within us, Campbell wrote. They are magnified dreams, and dreams are manifestations in image form of the energies of the body in conflict with each other. That is what myth is.
You've taken your first step into a larger world.
A mythological perspective on stories is therefore different than, let's say, an allegorical one. For the purpose of explaining the evolution of Star Wars, however, I'm going to simplify it somewhat and distinguish an allegory as a story that associates symbols with elements in the external world, and a myth as a story that associates them with elements in our internal one. In other words, a myth can be seen as a story for which it is easily possible to imagine it taking place entirely within a single human being, sort of like Inside Out.
All uniform. I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you.
Impossible to imagine it. Evolution of Star Wars, however, I'm going to simplify it somewhat and distinguish an allegory as a story that associates symbols with elements in the external world, and a myth as a story that associates them with elements in our internal one. In other words, a myth can be seen as a story for which it is easily possible to imagine it taking place entirely within a single human being, sort of like Inside Out.
All uniform. I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you.
So when you take a film like the original Star Wars, which was specifically modeled to be suited for this more mythological perspective, its entire galaxy becomes a mirror to our own self, and the force holding it together is our subconscious mind, our greater being that connects all the conflicting energies happening within it. These energies are partially symbolized by the light side, which strives for harmony and reflects actions that are driven by qualities like reason, prudence, and patience. The energies symbolized by the dark side, on the other hand, strive for dominance and control, and reflect that which is driven by anger and fear.
Let go your conscious self and act on instinct.
Luke Skywalker becomes our avatar in this journey, our conscious self struggling to find a balance between these conflicting energies, to find our place in the world and become a more well rounded and mature individual. He ventures into a world that exists mostly in service to this quest, a world where the dark side is embodied by the Empire, a government entity that needs ever more power to feel secure, that cannot rest until all is within its control, a futile effort that dooms us to suffering and destruction, that leaves us unconscious and enslaved to our darker impulses, as the mindless stormtroopers that serve this force so clearly demonstrate. Notice how, in a story like this, it doesn't matter who is beneath these helmets. The lack of identity and agency is exactly the point. They are more like shadows than real people, reflections of the parts of ourselves that are covered in darkness. If this was Inception, they would be the projections roaming our dreams.
I am the subject. My mind populates. You can literally talk to my subconscious.
The light side then is embodied by the Jedi and the rebellion.
And act on instinct.
Luke Skywalker becomes our avatar in this journey, our conscious self struggling to find a balance between these conflicting energies, to find our place in the world and become a more well rounded and mature individual. He ventures into a world that exists mostly in service to this quest, a world where the dark side is embodied by the Empire, a government entity that needs ever more power to feel secure, that cannot rest until all is within its control, a futile effort that dooms us to suffering and destruction, that leaves us unconscious and enslaved to our darker impulses, as the mindless stormtroopers that serve this force so clearly demonstrate. Notice how, in a story like this, it doesn't matter who is beneath these helmets. The lack of identity and agency is exactly the point. They are more like shadows than real people, reflections of the parts of ourselves that are covered in darkness. If this was Inception, they would be the projections roaming our dreams.
I am the subject. My mind populates. You can literally talk to my subconscious.
The light side then is embodied by the Jedi and the Rebellion, which Luke joins in their fight against the Empire. In the first film, Luke destroys the Death Star, but this was but a first step. It prevented the Empire from attaining an all-destructive weapon, and therefore brought, as the subtitle that was later added suggests, a new hope to the galaxy. Over the course of the next two films, the Empire's defenses are further weakened, but when Luke eventually reaches the root of their evil, and by extension the source of his own dark side,
Fulfill your destiny.
it becomes clear that victory is not achieved by forcefully destroying his perceived nemesis, but in reconciling with him.
Careful you must be when sensing the future, Anakin. The fear of loss is a path to the dark side.
This is also sort of supported by the prequels. Although I'm not sure if this was George Lucas's intention, the prequels expose a fundamental flaw in the Jedi philosophy by showing how they completely repress all emotions. In doing so, they failed to provide Anakin with the support and guidance he needed for a healthy transformation,
I feel lost. I'm not the Jedi I should be.
thereby causing the exact darkness they sought to prevent.
You must complete the training.
I can't keep the vision out of my head. They're my friends and I gotta help them.
Luke, on the other hand, succeeds where Anakin failed precisely because he ignored a part of his Jedi training. He finds his own way, his own balance, and this allows him to redeem Darth Vader and bring peace not only to the galaxy, but also to his inner self, to our inner self. For this was Star Wars as a myth, as a manifestation in image form of our inner conflicts, of our own struggle for personal transformation. But then all of this changed.
Who talks first? You talk first. I talk first.
There is a lot to say about the sequel trilogy, but on its most fundamental level, what I believe made these new films feel so different from the original ones is that it was no longer a story told as a myth. It became more allegorical rather than mythological. While it is easy to point at The Last Jedi as the film that was responsible for this, as it clearly and deliberately deconstructed some elements of the hero's journey as seen in the original trilogy, I'd say this process was already set in motion by The Force Awakens.
Chewie.
We're home.
As a sequel to the original trilogy, The Force Awakens continued the story, a hero's journey, that had already been completed. In doing so, it was bound to, at least to some extent, spoil that what gave it its sense of mythological wholeness.
You're Han Solo.
I used to be.
In this new world, the characters we know and love are no longer archetypal heroes in a timeless tale of adventure. Instead, they are now people that age and have lives beyond their heroic quests. The stormtroopers went from being shadows of an idea to individuals with faces and personalities. And in the case of Finn, a pretty vibrant one at that,
With resistance, yeah. I left the resistance.
thereby creating somewhat of a paradox as we are now told that these once faceless soldiers are actually real persons and tragic figures.
I was taken from a family I'll never know and raised to do one thing.
While at the same time they are still used as disposable nobodies when the story needs them as such.
I like this thing.
And the myth of Luke Skywalker became exactly that,
Force, Jedi. It's all true.
which made The Force Awakens more of a story about a myth rather than a recreation of it. It presented the original trilogy as a tale that now exists in a more complicated reality. For me, the problem with The Force Awakens is that it didn't seem to be aware of all this. It felt like it really wanted to be a story like A New Hope, but inadvertently became a story about A New Hope. It succeeded in
Thank you so
reflecting
much.
nostalgia for the
Thank
original
you.
story, properly establish a new one.
Sorry, it's hard to keep focused on the chat while I'm drawing, but I promise I'll be reading them. And thanks for the follow if you did give me that one, man.
And this is Star Killer Base.
I just can't really get into films that seem to exist for the sole purpose of reminding me of other, better films, which unfortunately was happening a lot around this time.
That first part was shit. They didn't need these genetic hybrids. They just needed dinosaurs, real dinosaurs. That's kind of
The Last Jedi, despite not being without its flaws, at least seemed to accept that Star Wars had changed,
It's time to let old tricks die.
that it had already moved away from its mythological origins and embraced this new context. Instead of trying to recapture the myth of old, The Last Jedi moved Star Wars into a new direction more suited for an allegorical interpretation. In doing so, all the elements that used to symbolize internal personal struggles now more explicitly reflected external societal ones. It showed us power relations
Oh, it's a channel called
and class.
like Stories of Old. He just released this video today, and he does a lot of good analysis of movies. Um, his voice can be a little annoying sometimes, depending on your taste, but I find he has really good insights over a lot of things. Check it out; it's really cool.
Systems.
Good guys, bad guys, made of dudes.
It showed us a world in which morality is no longer black and white, by judging
He like
evil is always more complicated than it
gets
appears.
into stuff from a philosophical point of view,
And it showed us a world where
which sometimes can be like overdoing it, but a lot of times it's cool, especially if you like a
where
movie.
fate had not predetermined who was chosen for a
How do you
greater
feel
destiny.
about the Star Wars trilogies?
You come from nothing. You're nothing.
The story of the characters too are also clearly centered
God, I missed a lot of stuff. I'm gonna rewind it a bit
reflecting
here.
nostalgia for the original story, but failed to properly establish a new one. Personally, I can enjoy it for a little while, but I usually check out around here.
This was the Death Star. And this is Star Killer Base.
I just can't really get into films that seem to exist for the sole purpose of reminding me of other, better films, which unfortunately was happening a lot around this time.
that first part was shit. They didn't need these genetic hybrids. They just needed dinosaurs, real dinosaurs. That's kind of
The Last Jedi, despite not being without its flaws, at least seemed to accept that Star Wars had changed,
It's time to let old tricks die.
that it had already moved away from its mythological origins and embraced this new context. Instead of trying to recapture the myth of old, The Last Jedi moved Star Wars into a new direction more suited for an allegorical interpretation. In doing so, all the elements that used to symbolize internal personal struggles now more explicitly reflected external societal ones. It showed us power relations, social political contexts, and class systems.
Good guys, bad guys, made of dudes.
It showed us a world in which morality is no longer black and white, by judging between good and evil is always more complicated than it appears.
It's all machine.
And it showed us a world where people's lives do not necessarily unfold according to the hero's journey, where fate had not predetermined who was chosen for a greater destiny.
You have no place in this story. You come from nothing. You're nothing.
The story of the characters too are also clearly centered around moving forward, and explores different ways this can be done,
No, you're still holding on. Let go.
ranging from burning the past
I always love when Kylo Ren screams that.
to letting its truly important lessons guide us into new paths. I don't like everything in this film, and overall, I don't think it ever becomes greater than the sum of its parts. But it did succeed in creating a break from tradition that, at the very least, opened the door for Star Wars to surprise us again, to break the mold and become something new. Which is why it is such a shame that, ultimately, it didn't.
First Order was just the beginning. I will give you so much more.
The Rise of Skywalker came out last year. The trailers were again phenomenal, But this time I was more wary given that J.J. Abrams, the director of the overly nostalgic The Force Awakens, had returned to helm
It's
his
called
production
like
of
Stories of Old. That's the name of the channel itself.
In short, my worst expectations came true. I don't think there was a better image of how this film tried to circle back and reverse everything in the previous film than Kylo Ren gluing back together the helmet that was so symbolically destroyed in The Last Jedi.
Really thoughtful guy.
Well done. I like it.
Anyways, Emperor Palpatine is back, Rey is of special heritage after all, and she ends up with a yellow lightsaber because, I don't know, I'm not going to watch this again. All in all, the sequel trilogy felt like watching a discussion between filmmakers that should have been had before they made it. Now we have one vision looking to the future, sandwiched between one that seemed stuck in the past. And to me, it's just tiresome. So, what does all this say about the state of this franchise? Where do we go from here? What is the destiny of Star Wars? Even though the nature of its storytelling has fundamentally changed since the original trilogy, I would argue that this evolution was not only inevitable, but also vitally important for the future of Star Wars. Now, mythological storytelling can be great, and as The Lord of the Rings perhaps best showed us, there are creative ways to cleverly subvert some of its elements while still telling a meaningful and wholesome story. But there are limitations too.
Yeah, no problem, man. Thank you so much for joining the stream.
To be boarded off from the real world.
My channel's
Besides the fact that when
pretty
it
young,
comes to
so
Star
I don't
Wars,
have a
we
lot
already are long past this point. There are
of
some
traffic here,
larger
so I
issues
really
with this
appreciate
as
it.
well. For one, myths have been criticized for being too general, like horoscopes that are just vague enough for most people to derive some meaning from it, without them having to actually say anything specific.
All remaining systems will bow to the First Order!
Take, for example, how the Empire and the First Order clearly take their aesthetics from fascist governments, but don't provide us with much critical insight about them. It's more of a visual shortcut to establish the evil force rather than a meaningful commentary.
Remember, a Jedi can feel the Force flowing through him.
Myths also tend to be egocentric. They tend to focus on the individual as an isolated being, as someone whose world exists entirely for the purpose of their personal transformation, rather than show them as existing in a wider and more complex social reality. And this last bit, I think, is why Star Wars had to evolve in order for it to endure. Because Star Wars as a myth is Star Wars as the Skywalker saga, and this not only fosters the belief that established heroes are sacred and new ones are to be rejected. To me, this also places unnecessary restrictions on a universe that was destined to become so much more. We have already seen how this evolution elevated the story of the main films. We saw how one convenient plot element in A New Hope became a beautiful story of rebellion and sacrifice. We saw how giving identities and stories to the clone troopers added a new layer of emotional weight to the execution of Order 66. And how doing the same for the other Jedi made us feel the wider repercussions of this monumental event. I can only imagine how, in time, it will elevate the Star Wars universe as a whole.
We have what they grow beyond.
But for this, we also need to evolve. For a long time, I have been waiting for that one great Star Wars film to blow me away, to become my definitive Star Wars story, like the original trilogy was for so many people. But a while ago, I realized I was being naive, childish even. I didn't see the real treasure that was given me. When I was introduced to Star Wars, the story of Luke Skywalker was already well in the past, fading into this world's collective memory. And revisiting now feels a bit strange. It is almost too simplistic to fit in this now more expansive and complicated universe, like a bedtime story that parents tell their children rather than something that actually happened. But this is okay because even though the myth may have passed into history, the universe it brought into existence has not. And this, to me, is the true legacy of Star Wars. This is its greatest achievement. It gave us a whole other universe to immerse ourselves in, a place filled with exotic planets and environments, with fascinating peoples and creatures, a place rich with meanings and symbols, with the sounds of lightsabers, spaceships, blasters, and droids. And at the end of the day, this is what I truly want. I want to be transported. I want to detach from my own reality, just for a little bit, to enjoy this world of adventure and wonder, in whatever form it takes. I want to see what the Mandalorian and Baby Yoda are up to. I want to pilot an X-Wing in squadrons. I want to travel back again to the Old Republic. And above all, I want to explore entirely new stories. I want to see new planets, new heroes and villains. I want to see what this faraway galaxy is like 1,000 years into the future. And I want everyone else to enjoy this too, to find their own place in this universe, to find their own stories. For ultimately, this is what Star Wars can be. This is what it already is. Like my own history with Star Wars, more and more people are finding their own unique ways into this universe. They are no longer bound by a singular doorway, by one singular story, which will likely become even more true in the future as new generations discover this ever expanding franchise. And I think it is time to truly embrace this, to let go of our limited perspective of what Star Wars should be, to let go of the idea of this world existing solely for me instead of for all of us, and see a universe of stories that is constantly evolving, a universe that is virtually endless, that is limited only by our own imagination. Besides experiencing Star Wars stories, it is also a lot of fun, as so many have already been doing, to tell them yourself. And to make this easier than ever, there is Campfire Blaze. Blaze is a browser-based set of tools to keep your intergalactic adventures organized. You can work by yourself or collaborate with friends to flesh out your story in Blaze's word processor. You can create characters, design your plot, and world build without restrictions. When you're done, you can easily share your story with friends and fans. If you want to expand Campfire Blaze's free version, you can add additional tools and own them forever with a one-time purchase. Alternatively, you can build your own subscription so you're only paying for the features you need. Adding modules can be done for as little as 50 cents, but you can also unlock everything for just a few dollars per month with a 30-day return policy. Because Campfire Blaze is currently in open beta, it is completely free to use for the remainder of October. So if you want to check out this next generation of writing software, hurry over to Campfire Blaze by clicking on the link in the description and start writing stories better and faster today.
Expected is bankers waiting for your call.
459. Close enough.
Unexpected Is your banker working for you when...
In his novel The Idiot, Dostoevsky made the ambiguous statement, "Beauty will save the world." The quote puzzled many in the decades that followed, including novelist and historian Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who in his Nobel lecture in 1970 replied, "What sort of a statement is that? For a long time I considered it mere words. How could that be possible? When in bloodthirsty history did beauty ever save anyone from anything? Ennobled, uplifted, yes. But whom has it saved?" This, I believe, is the question that lies at the heart of Cloud Atlas, directed by Tom Tykwer and the Wachowskis, and based on the book by David Mitchell. Cloud Atlas tells 6 different stories, separated by time and genre, and yet connected by a seemingly thin thread of fate and coincidence, as the main characters of each story find inspiration in the stories that preceded theirs to ultimately change their own in a meaningful way. In many ways, it's a story about stories, about the peculiar way in which we can convey a life experience from one individual to another, from one generation to the next. We do this through diaries, letters, literature, films, and in more abstract ways through religion and mythology. Solzhenitsyn, who is referenced in the film more than once, uses the overarching term art to capture what he sees as the only substitute for an experience we ourselves have never lived through. And it is here that he found the essence of Dostoevsky's world-saving beauty and came to understand it not as a careless phrase, but as a prophecy. To really understand the meaning of this, we have to dig a little deeper into the themes explored in Cloud Atlas, which author David Mitchell describes as:
one is the interconnectedness of cause and effect, and you think you have your own little life and it runs along its own tracks, especially these days. We think we're islands, but actually we're interconnected archipelagos of islands. Number 2, it's about predacity, the way individuals prey on individuals, tribes on tribes, corporations on their host societies, states on the individuals within those states. The mechanics, the electronics of predacity, if I'm allowed to use language like that.
Let's begin with the interconnectedness of cause and effect.
Our lives are not our own. From womb to tomb, we are bound to others, past and present. And by each crime and every kindness, they birth our future.
Cloud Atlas leans heavy on the notion of eternal recurrence, which is often associated with spiritual concepts like reincarnation and karma. However, the filmmakers expressed that although they welcomed spiritual interpretations, they also specifically wanted to explore secular perspectives.
There were days where I was preferring, within your, let's say, genetic string that you're actually playing, rather than saying the soul that is connecting your characters. And that there were different words and different description for the whole idea of eternal recurrence and of what you might call reincarnation, which is a word that we're not afraid of. But at the same time, if you say it's a movie about reincarnation, we would feel like that's a limitation of perspective.
The interconnectedness of cause and effect is shown in the book by the motif of a comet-shaped birthmark found on the main characters of each story, suggesting they are the same soul embodying different characters. But in the film they changed this by using the same actors to play different roles, turning the journey of one soul into a story of many. By reusing the same actors, they purposefully alienate the audience from the individual characters to instead encourage them to draw connections between them to a level that transcends their individual stories.
I love this idea that we can show, just at a facial level, that the main characters in the film are being reincarnated again and again. The time zones, so what you get is a sort of the word is actually matrix, pilgrims' progresses of characters on ethical journeys through time. just through the faces of the actors.
Another way the filmmakers expanded on the theme of interconnectedness is by changing the narrative structure of the original novel. After a brief prologue, the 6 storylines are somewhat similarly to the novel, briefly introduced in chronological order. But then there's a pivotal moment where that structure is broken.
There's a very particular moment where once the field opens up to like intercutting between the sequences without any order anymore, but with an internal connectedness and the internal flow that seems to, that in our opinion even does make more sense than any other structure could have made for a movie, which is in the beginning of Reel 3, where Jim Sturgis as Chang meets Sonmi for the first time.
I know you are Sonmi 451.
And they have this moment, and you can stay with what you're used to, or you can go elsewhere and join us. And we felt like, okay, you've had 40 minutes to get prepared for it. And now you should take that choice.
You can remain here and risk being discovered. Or you can come with me.
Again, the distinctive qualities of film are used to further diffuse the boundaries between each story and emphasize their interconnectedness, leading to a structure where stories are intercut based on musical flow, visual connections, and shared emotional states. The purpose of all this is to show, regardless of your spiritual or religious beliefs, the deeply intricate ways in which our actions impact the world around us, captured into words in Sonmi's revelation.
We talked about it a lot, this Jose Saramago line that we referenced.
The nature of our immortal lives is in the consequences of our words and deeds that go on apportioning themselves throughout all time.
This is a really beautiful secular way of expressing karma or reincarnation.
This brings us to the second theme of Cloud Atlas, which reveals the implications of this interconnectedness of cause and effect, and brings us closer to answering the opening question of how beauty will save the world.
There is only one rule that binds all people, one governing principle that binds every relationship with God's green earth.
Perdacity is the main source of conflict in Cloud Atlas. It is reflected in the stories of each of the characters as they struggle against greed, power, malevolence, and all the other qualities that lead to victors and victims, oppressors and oppressed, reflected by the simple mantra,
The weak are meat, and the strong do eat.
If we take the interconnectedness of the stories into account, there appears to be a demoralizing truth to this statement. For although the individual stories end with the main characters achieving some form of victory over the oppressing forces they're facing, on the larger cosmic scale, these victories feel rather inconsequential as the progress made in each story is diminished by a new form of oppression in the next.
There is a natural order to this world, and those who try to upend it do not fare well.
It raises a serious issue for moral behavior on the individual level. For why should I suffer and sacrifice for a greater good that's never going to manifest itself? Why should I stand against injustice if my efforts will only end up being inconsequential? Here, Solzhenitsyn writes, if only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart.
At this point in my life, all I know, Sixsmith, is that this world spins from the same unseen forces that twist our hearts.
During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is, at various ages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times he is close to being a devil, at times to sainthood, but his name doesn't change, and to that name we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. He adds that although we can't expel evil and injustice on this grand cosmic scale, we can constrict it within our own heart.
I owe my life to a self-freed slave. And I cannot, in good conscience, participate in this kind of business any longer.
Here we do have agency, and we can make a difference. but we ourselves are responsible to assume it, and this takes courage and honesty, which at last brings us to the purpose of art. Against eternal injustice, art offers beauty as its equally eternal antidote. In the words of Polish poet Cyprian Norwid, beauty is to enthuse us for work, and work is to raise us up. It is difficult to define what this beauty is, but this is exactly the point. It is up to you to do it. You have to bring your own agency to it and define what it is. Art in all its many forms can help you do this, or at the very least, it will help you discover what it's not. This process is reflected by the main characters in the film. Even though their comet-shaped birthmarks no longer represent a spiritual or genetic connection, it does suggest a new connection through beauty, as they all find meaning and motivation in the beauty transferred to them from those who came before. It allows each of the characters to elevate their individual and highly particular struggles to something that comes closer to carrying universal meaning.
Freedom, the fatuous jingle of our civilization. But only those deprived of it have the barest inkling of what it really is.
This, hopefully, is when we realize that the boundary between our heart and the rest of the world is just a convention, waiting to be transcended. If we can conceive of doing so, then even the tiniest victory becomes one of cosmic significance.
Someone already
Solzhenitsyn wrote that one drop of truth can outweigh an ocean of lies, to which Cloud Atlas adds,
What is an ocean? But a multitude of drops.
It emphasizes that it only takes one drop to preserve goodness and justice. Within a limitless ocean, the existence of this drop is not a lost cause, it is all that matters. And so Cloud Atlas makes its case for how the human heart, over and over again, will save the world in its entirety. It doesn't give you a definitive moral path, but it does urge you to take up your responsibility to find one for yourself, to stop doing the things that make you feel weak and stand up for what is truly meaningful, to be that one drop in the ocean. On this issue, Pope John Paul II presented a letter to the artists in which he wrote, "On the threshold of the third millennium, my hope for all of you who are artists is that you will have an especially intense experience of creative inspiration. May the beauty which you pass on to generations still to come be such that it will stir them to wonder. Faced with the sacredness of life and of the human person, and before the marvels of the universe, wonder is the only appropriate attitude. From this wonder there can come that enthusiasm of which Norman spoke in his poem. People of today and tomorrow need this enthusiasm if they are going to meet and master the crucial challenges which stand before us. Thanks to this enthusiasm, humanity, every time it loses its way, will be able to lift itself up and set out again on the right path." In this sense, it has been said, with profound insight, that beauty will save the world. This video is brought to you by Mubi, an online cinema streaming hand-picked exceptional films from around the globe. Get 1 month free at mubi.com/like stories of old.
You'll make it. I won't let you die.
One recurring element in the films of Darren Aronofsky is that his main characters are driven and often destroyed by obsessions. His debut film Pi featured a mathematician obsessed with logical patterns. Requiem for a Dream is about the euphoria found in drug use and the obsessive addictions they lead to. In Black Swan, the ballerina is obsessed with achieving the perfect performance. And of all the biblical stories, Aronofsky chose to tell the one of Noah, a man obsessed with an apocalyptic prophecy. The Fountain 2 features a protagonist struggling with an obsession, one that is perhaps the most universal of all.
Let's finish it.
The Fountain is famously ambitious in its presentation. In the far future, an immortal man travels to a dying star where he hopes his wife will be reborn. Along the way, he remembers what I generally consider to be the memories of his past self. In these flashbacks, we see the story of Tommy, a man trying to save his beloved Tommy. Along the way, he remembers what I generally consider to be the memory. The Fountain is famously ambitious in its presentation. In the far future, an immortal man travels to a dying star where he hopes his wife will be reborn. Along the way, he remembers what I generally consider to be the memories of his past self. In these flashbacks, we see the story of Tommy, a man trying to save his beloved wife Izzy from dying by finding a cure for her terminal illness.
It's time for you to read it.
In a third storyline, we are presented with Izzy's unfinished book, The Fountain, which tells the tale of a Spanish conquistador in the 16th century on an expedition to find the Tree of Life.
Will you deliver Spain from bondage?
Upon my honor and my life.
When you return, together we will live forever.
These storylines, however, aren't neatly separated by time as the original trailer suggested, but rather they flow into each other. They are intertwined to the point where acts in one storyline even seem to affect the outcomes of another. This is most obvious in the first story, where future Tommy saves the conquistador and pushes his quest forward. But consider also how Tommy discovers what would eventually be his immortality formula through a revelation caused by what appears to be a divine intervention.
Remember that ethnobotanical compound we played around with last year?
Which one? From that tree? That one from Central America.
It is this kind of interrelation between the stories that complicates interpreting the actual plot of the film. Aronofsky stated he intentionally left it up to the viewer to decide what parts of the story are a metaphor and which are not.
I think it's more of the fun of the piece of who's actually exists and who doesn't exist, and who's a memory and who's a story, and what's a metaphor and what's not a metaphor.
Aronofsky compared the film to a Rubik's Cube that can be solved in multiple ways but has only one solution. Some have taken this to mean that the plot is a puzzle waiting to be arranged into one definitive interpretation. But I think it rather suggests that no matter how you make sense of the plot, the underlying meaning of the story remains the same. And while it may be fun to discuss the different ways the story can be pieced together, it is ultimately that deeper thematic current that gives us a real insight into what The Fountain is about, the essence of which, I believe, is captured in one key scene.
Hey, what are you doing here?
Take a walk with me.
I have too much work.
It's the first snow.
Yeah, I know, but they're waiting on me.
The choice to go with Izzy or continue his work is presented here as a distant memory, one that Tommy isn't ready to face.
Come on, Tommy.
Please, Izzy.
Again, how and when this story unfolds depends on your interpretation of the different storylines. If you interpret the stories in literal terms, we're witnessing the tragic memories of an immortal man in the distant future. But there are some interpretations that approach this future storyline as purely metaphorical, a representation of Tommy's subconscious as he struggles with the loss of his wife. Either way, I can't think of a better image of grief than a man drifting alone in a timeless darkness. The vision of his wife keeps haunting him, urging him to listen, and he finally accepts the invitation.
I trust you. Take me. Show me.
To me, the journey that follows feels more like a meditation or even a prayer answered by a higher entity, taking place outside the familiarity of time and space where memories and desires, history and dreams all flow into one.
Come on, Tommy.
Please, Izzy.
We are brought back to the choice. Go with Izzy or go to work. While the lighting and religious imagery already hints at what choice should be made, Tommy heads the other way, and so will we. Going down this path, we find a surgeon striving to find a cure for his wife's illness. It's an ambition that later, despite having made an almost miraculous breakthrough, turns into a more obsessive battle against the very concept of death itself.
The Donovan breakthrough is our starting point. It's just a starting point. All right, let's build on. Stop aging, stop dying. Stop dying. That's our goal.
In this sense, Tommy is a literal example of Ernest Becker's death-denying human, a denial that stems from the dissonance between having a spirit that is conscious, curious, and capable of forming deep connections, and having that spirit be born into a body that is vulnerable to damage and sickness, a body that will someday die. This is the terror, to have emerged from nothing, to have a name, consciousness of self, deep inner feelings, an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression, and with all this, yet to die. For Tommy, all these inner feelings and desires are embodied in the love for his wife, a love that he is so attached to that he wants to hold on to it forever. But to do so would mean he would have to conquer death. As a consequence, he becomes trapped in the future, stuck in a mental abstraction outside the present where his salvation, his eternity, always seems just within reach.
I just need a little more time. There's hope. It's real hope. We're close. I will find it. There's time. We have time. It's okay. Everything's gonna be all right.
Witnessing her husband's growing obsession, Izzy, probably both out of love and frustration, urges him to read a book about a conquistador named Tomas who is trying to save his queen from the invading inquisitor.
Your mother's spice relation is mine. Soon she will be powerless against me.
A not too subtle metaphor for Izzy's experience with the illness slowly spreading inside her body, and the husband who seems half a world away to complete an impossible task.
Just take a few days at home. Spend a little time with Izzy.
I'm here for her.
The book comes to an abrupt ending when Tomas finds the hidden temple containing the Tree of Life and is struck down by its guardian. Pausing the film at the right moment gives us a glimpse at this final paragraph. Tomas knows more clearly than he has ever known any other thing that he cannot beat this beast. The pagan raises his sword above his head. Staring into the flames, Tomas sees the demons of hell feasting on his soul, maggots crawling through his flesh, and the blade and the flame was falling towards him, shuddering inevitably towards his chest. Tomas's fear paralyzed him. All he would see was death. It once again portrays Tommy's view of death as something ugly, something that has to be denied and evaded at all costs, despite knowing the effort will ultimately be pointless.
Death is a disease. It's like any other. And there's a cure. A cure. And I will find it.
And this is exactly where Izzy differentiates herself from Tommy. Unlike Tommy, Izzy comes to terms with her mortality by accepting her life as a small piece in the ongoing process of creation, which is allowing her to live in the present, where she, more than anything, longs for Tommy to just be with her.
Hello? Antonio, what's wrong?
In the film, her worldview is inspired by ancient Mayan philosophy, but it also clearly includes Eastern influences, which are probably best articulated by Eckhart Tolle, who in his book The Power of Now writes, "To offer no resistance to life is to be in a state of grace, ease, and lightness. This state is then no longer dependent upon things being in a certain way, good or bad. All those things, of course, will still pass away. Cycles will come and go, but with dependency gone, there is no fear of loss anymore."
I'm not afraid anymore, Tommy.
It's this almost stoic acceptance that freed her from her mental prison, which is also made clear by the fact that she wants Tommy to finish her book.
Won't you help me? finish it.
which not only serves as a way to help Tommy face his own mortality, but also as a token of her willingness to leave things unfinished, leave her attachments and be fully present in the current moment, whatever it may bring.
All right, thank you everybody for joining. Whoever's still here and whoever joined. I think I'll stop here. I'll continue later on today or maybe tomorrow. But I think this is good for now. So thank you everybody. And make sure to follow me on Instagram if you want to see updates and learn more about what I'm doing.